The cabin smelled like forgotten winters. That was the first thing I noticed when I pushed open the warped wooden door. A scent of cold ash, damp timber, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender that had given up being fragrant years ago. The hinges groaned as if they resented being disturbed, and the sound echoed through the trees behind me like a warning I chose to ignore. I told myself I had no choice. My name is Rose, and 3 days ago, I had a home. 2 days ago, I had a pack. 1 day ago, I had a direction. By the time I found that cabin buried deep in the neutral forest between the Eastern Territories and the Ridgelands, I had nothing left but a wool cloak soaked through at the hem and a stubbornness that even exhaustion couldn't fully extinguish. The cabin was small. 1 room, stone fireplace, a cot pushed against the far wall with a moth-eaten blanket folded neatly on top of it, as if someone had left it there with care and never come back. A single window, filmed with grime, let in the gray afternoon light. The floor was packed dirt with 2 wooden planks across the center that creaked under my weight. There was a rusted iron hook by the door, a 3-legged stool, and a shelf holding 2 clay mugs and nothing else. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. I hung my cloak on the hook and let myself breathe for the first time in what felt like days. The tension I had been carrying in my shoulders, that rigid, constant bracing against whatever might come next, loosened just slightly in the silence of those 4 walls. No voices, no judgments, no one looking at me like I was a problem they hadn't figured out how to solve yet. I sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off my boots. My feet were pale and wrinkled from hours of damp leather, and I pressed them flat against the cool dirt floor and just felt the earth beneath me. Steady, unmoving, indifferent in the best way. Let me explain what I am, because it matters. In our world, the hierarchy is not subtle. Alphas lead, betas serve, omegas survive, or at least, that is the polite version. The honest version is that omegas like me exist at the margins of every room, every gathering, every decision. We are tolerated when we are useful, overlooked when we are not, and dismissed the moment we become inconvenient. I had spent 23 years being all 3 in turns. My pack, the Ashvale Pack, a mid-sized territory in the Eastern Ridge, had dissolved 3 weeks ago. Not in fire or battle, but in the quiet, devastating way that things end when leadership collapses inward. Our alpha, a man named Corbett, had made an alliance that fractured everything. I won't say more about him than that, because the anger still sits too hot in my chest, and this is not a story about him. The point is, I left. I gathered what I could carry, and I walked north into the neutral forest that no pack claims and no pack patrols, because neutrality felt safer than the rubble of loyalty. I hadn't planned to stay in the cabin. I told myself I would rest for an hour, maybe 2, and then keep moving toward the village market town at the edge of the ridge, where unattached wolves sometimes found work or passage. But the moth-eaten blanket was softer than it looked, and the silence was so complete it felt like a hand pressing gently against my forehead, and before I understood what was happening, I was lying down. I was asleep before the light changed. I don't know how long I slept. What I know is that I woke to the sound of footsteps, not the small, tentative sound of an animal investigating. These were deliberate, heavy, each step precise and unhurried, the kind of footfall that belongs to something that has never needed to be quiet because it has never needed to be afraid. I was on my feet before I was fully conscious, the blanket falling away, my back pressing to the wall beside the fireplace out of instinct. My heart was striking so hard I could feel it in my temples. The door handle moved. Then it stopped. A pause. Long enough that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Then the door opened. He filled the frame completely. That is not an exaggeration. There was simply no space around him. He was tall in the way that made the cabin's low ceiling suddenly feel present, broad across the shoulders, dressed in dark leather with fur at the collar and crossing straps of worn brown across his chest. His hair was long, pulled back in thick braids that fell over one shoulder, and his eyes, even in the gray afternoon light that barely made it through the dirty window, were the color of deep water. Blue-gray, still and deep and very, very focused. On me. He did not draw a weapon. He did not speak. He simply looked at me with an expression that was entirely unreadable, and in the silence that stretched between us, I understood three things simultaneously. First, this man was an alpha. Not by title alone, but in every line of him. The absolute stillness, the weight of presence, the way the air in the room had rearranged itself around him the moment he stepped through the door. Second, this was not an abandoned cabin, or at least, it was not abandoned to him. Third, I was in serious trouble. I didn't know anyone used this place, I said, because silence felt more dangerous than words. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised both of us, I think. I'll go. He didn't move. The storm, he said. His voice was low, measured, with a roughness to it like gravel under still water. It's coming in from the North Ridge. You won't make the tree line before it hits. I hadn't noticed a storm. I glanced toward the dirty window and saw, for the first time, that the gray light had deepened to something heavier. The trees beyond the glass were moving, not gently, with the kind of urgent swaying that meant the wind had already found its direction. I'll be fine, I said. You'll be soaked through in 10 minutes and frozen by nightfall. That's my concern. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite irritation. Something quieter than either. You're Ashvale, he said. It wasn't a question. My stomach dropped. How? Your cloak. He nodded toward the hook by the door where my wet wool hung. There was a small repair on the left hem, stitched in blue thread, the color of Ashvale's border-marking tradition, subtle enough that most people wouldn't catch it. He had caught it in seconds. I said nothing. Ashvale dissolved, he said. Still that same flat, even tone. No triumph in it, no cruelty, just fact. 3 weeks ago. I'm aware, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stepped fully inside the cabin, and the door swung shut behind him, and I felt the room shrink by half. He crossed to the fireplace, crouched with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in their body, and began to build a fire from the small stack of wood beside the hearth, as if I weren't standing 3 feet away with my back still pressed to the wall. I watched him work in total disbelief. What are you doing? I asked. Building a fire. He didn't look up. You're cold. The storm is coming. There's wood. You don't know me. No, he agreed. Then why? Sit down, Omega. He said it without harshness, without the particular edge that word usually carries when powerful people use it at me. It came out almost like a direction one might give to someone who had been standing too long. Like, rest. You've been walking for days. I can see it in how you're standing. I wanted to refuse on principle. Every reasonable instinct I had told me to grab my cloak and walk out that door into the gathering storm, because a strange alpha in a small cabin in the neutral forest was exactly the kind of situation that ended badly for women like me. But the fire was catching. The warmth was beginning to reach across the narrow space. And he was right. I could barely feel my feet. I sat on the 3-legged stool, rigid and watchful, as close to the door as I could manage. The fire crackled and grew. He remained crouched before it for another moment, and then he rose and turned and looked at me across the small room, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't expected. Not calculation, not possession, not the particular hunger that powerful men sometimes wore when they found something unguarded in their territory. He looked, for just a fraction of a second, like someone who had not expected to find another person in this place either. Like someone who had come here, of all places, to be alone. Outside, the first drops of rain struck the window. Inside, neither of us spoke. And I thought, I don't even know his name. But something in the careful way he had built that fire, the way he had not asked me to leave, had not demanded explanation, had simply addressed the most immediate problem with quiet competence, made me think that his name, when I learned it, was going to matter more than I was prepared for. His name was Tristan. I didn't learn it from him. I learned it from the storm. That sounds stranger than it is. What I mean is this. While the rain hammered the cabin roof in long, relentless sheets, and the wind found every gap in the old timber walls, I sat on my three-legged stool and watched the fire and tried to make sense of the man sitting on the floor across from me, his back against the far wall, one knee drawn up, reading through a folded piece of parchment he had pulled from inside his leather vest. He read with complete focus. Not performatively, not the way people sometimes pretend to be busy to avoid conversation. He was genuinely, entirely elsewhere, his blue-gray eyes tracking across lines I couldn't read from where I sat, one finger occasionally tracing a border or a mark on what appeared to be a territorial map. I studied his face, the way you study a landscape you're trying to memorize before you have to leave it. Carefully, in pieces, not all at once. The jaw was strong, the dark beard close-cropped. There was a scar along the left side of his neck, thin and pale, old enough to have settled into his skin like it had always belonged there. His braids had loosened slightly from the journey through the storm, and a few dark strands had fallen forward across his forehead. He didn't push them back. He looked like someone who had once been at war and had come out the other side of it not triumphant, but quieter. Changed in ways that didn't show unless you were paying attention. I was paying attention. A branch struck the window, and I flinched before I could stop myself. He looked up immediately, not in alarm, just in the automatic alertness of someone whose instincts never fully rest. His eyes found mine across the firelit room. "It'll pass by morning," he said. "You know this area." "Yes. This cabin is yours." He considered the word, in a manner of speaking. "Which manner?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I built it." That genuinely surprised me, and I didn't hide it well. He noticed. 7 years ago, he added, folding the map and tucking it back inside his vest. I needed somewhere outside the territory, somewhere quiet. Somewhere to be alone, I thought again. I didn't say it. "I'm sorry I was sleeping in it," I said instead. "Don't be." He said it simply, without the overly gracious tone people use when they want credit for being magnanimous. He just meant it. You needed shelter. It was there. The fire popped and sent a small spray of sparks up the chimney. The rain was so loud now it had become almost rhythmic, almost comforting. A wall of white noise that made the cabin feel like a separate world from everything outside it. Tristan. The name came from outside. A voice cutting through the rain, close enough that it had to belong to someone standing just beyond the door. Male, deep, carrying the particular edge of controlled urgency. The man across from me was on his feet before the second syllable had fully landed. He moved to the door and opened it, and a gust of cold, wet air rushed in so sharply I pulled my cloak tighter without thinking. Standing in the rain was a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped dark hair, plastered flat against his forehead, a heavy, oiled canvas cloak, doing imperfect work against the downpour. He was younger than Tristan by a few years, with a square jaw and dark eyes that flicked past Tristan's shoulder and found me with an expression of naked surprise. He recovered fast. Scouts reported movement on the western edge. 3 riders, Dawnvale colors. He dropped his voice, but the cabin was small and the storm was loud and I heard every word. Could be advanced surveyors. Tristan was quiet for 2 seconds. How far? 2 miles, maybe less. They weren't moving like they were lost. Another pause. Then, hold position. Don't engage. I'll be at the ridge post within the hour. The man, I would learn his name was Owen, Tristan's second, looked past his shoulder at me one more time. There was nothing threatening in it. Just assessment. Calculation. The way a careful person catalogs new information. Then he was gone, back into the rain, and Tristan closed the door. He turned to face me, and for the first time since he had walked into this cabin, I saw something behind the stillness. Not fear. Something more controlled than fear. Responsibility. The weight of it was visible in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You need to stay here tonight," he said. I blinked. "Excuse me?" The western approach is the direction of the market road. If Dawnvale riders are moving in that corridor, the path you'd take out of the neutral forest runs directly through their line of sight. He held my gaze. "I'm not ordering you. I'm telling you the geography." I understood the distinction he was making, and I appreciated it more than I expected to. Dawnvale. Even I knew that name, tucked away in the eastern ridge as I had been. They were a large pack, aggressive in expansion, clinical about territory acquisition. Ashvale had shared a border with their western edge for decades, and that border had always been a source of low-level tension. Corbett, my former alpha, had tried to negotiate an alliance with them. That was, in fact, the decision that had fractured everything. "Dawnvale was part of why my pack fell," I said. Tristan looked at me steadily. "I know. You know a lot about Ashvale. I know a lot about most packs in this region. That's part of what I do." "And what is it that you do?" I asked. I kept my voice even, but the question carried weight. I still didn't know who he was beyond his first name, and the fact that he had built this cabin and commanded a man who moved with the deference of a trained soldier. He held my gaze for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face. "I lead the Iron Vale," he said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Iron Vale. I had grown up hearing that name the way children hear about distant mountains. Real, enormous, and somehow existing in a category separate from ordinary life. The Iron Vale pack held the Northern Ridge territories, the high ground, the old forests. They were the largest unified pack in the region by a significant measure, and their Alpha King, a title that actually meant something, passed through lineage and confirmed through challenge, had held that position for 6 years without a single successful opposition. His name, according to every account I had ever heard, was Tristan Vale. I was sitting in a one-room cabin in a neutral forest with the Alpha King of the Northern Ridge, and I had told him I would be fine in a storm. Something must have moved across my face, because he watched me work through it with the patience of someone who had done this before. Waited while people recalibrated around the weight of what he was. "You should have said," I managed. "You didn't ask. Most people in your position lead with it. Most people in my position lead with it because they need the reaction it causes." He crossed back to his place against the far wall and lowered himself to the floor with that same easy, unhurried movement. "I don't." I stared at him. He picked up the map again. I didn't sleep. I sat on the cot with my knees drawn up and my cloak around my shoulders, and I watched the fire burn lower and thought about everything I knew and everything I didn't. Tristan worked. He spread the map across the floor and added to it with a small piece of charcoal he'd pulled from his vest pocket, marking positions, tracing lines. Occasionally he would go still and stare at a particular section for a long time before making a small, precise addition. He did not ask for my input. He did not perform concentration. He was simply concentrated. Around what I estimated was midnight, he set the map aside and leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. "The Dawnvale have been testing borders for 4 months," he said, without opening his eyes. His voice had dropped, quieter now. 3 packs have lost border settlements, 1 dissolved entirely. "Ashvale," I said. "Ashvale." A pause. Corbett made a deal he couldn't honor. When he couldn't deliver, they took what they wanted anyway. I had known this. Hearing it said plainly, without embellishment or apology, made it settle differently in my chest. Not heavier, just cleaner. Like a wound that needed air. "What are they looking for?" I asked. "The surveyors on the western edge." He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. "The neutral forest. This forest isn't claimed." "Exactly." He turned his head and looked at me across the dim room. The fire was low now, deep amber and quiet. "It's the last major unclaimed corridor in the region. Whoever controls it controls movement between the eastern territories and the northern ridge." A pause. "Including this cabin." I looked at the rough stone walls, the low ceiling, the 2 clay mugs on the shelf. "That's why you came tonight," I said slowly. "It wasn't a patrol route." "No." "You came to check if Dawnvale had already moved into the neutral forest." He was quiet for a moment. "And I found you sleeping instead." There was no accusation in it. If anything, there was something almost wry in the flatness of his delivery. The particular dry humor of a man who had expected one kind of problem and found an entirely different one. Despite everything, I almost smiled. "I'm sorry to have been a complication," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, before turning his gaze back to the ceiling. "You're not a complication, Rose." The sound of my own name in his voice, said quietly, without performance, as if he had simply known it and chosen this moment to use it, stopped me completely. I hadn't told him my name. "How do you know my name?" The question came out quieter than I intended. Not accusatory, just genuine. The fire had burned down to its lowest point, and in the amber half-dark of the cabin, the distance between us felt both very small and very significant. Tristan didn't look away from the ceiling. "Owen recognized your cloak markings before I did." He ran the description against the Ashvale dispersal record. A pause. "We keep records of displaced pack members in the neutral corridor. It's a safety measure." "A safety measure?" I repeated. "People pass through here alone and vulnerable. Knowing who they are means we can respond appropriately if something happens to them." I turned that over in my mind. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also the kind of reasoning that could mean many things depending on the person giving it, and I had learned, slowly, and at some personal cost, not to accept explanations simply because they sounded sensible. "Respond appropriately," I said. "What does that mean for someone like me? An unattached Omega from a dissolved pack?" He finally moved his gaze from the ceiling and looked at me directly. In the low firelight, his eyes were darker than before, the blue almost entirely swallowed by shadow. "It means exactly what it sounds like," he said. "Protection, if needed. Passage assistance, if requested. Nothing more. And if I don't want either, then nothing at all." He said it without hesitation, without the particular defensive edge that men sometimes acquire when their generosity is questioned. "You're not obligated to me, Rose. You were sleeping in a cabin I built in an unclaimed forest. That doesn't create a debt." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling myself, and the rain pressed on, and neither of us spoke for a long time. Morning came gray and waterlogged. I woke to the sound of birds, the hesitant, exploratory kind that emerge after heavy rain to test whether the world has survived, and pale light coming through the grimy window, and the smell of wood smoke that meant someone had rebuilt the fire while I slept. Tristan was gone. The cabin was empty, and for one disorienting moment, I sat up on the cot and felt the specific loneliness of waking in a strange place, to find that the one familiar presence has left without a word. Then I pushed that feeling aside firmly, because it was not a feeling I had any business having about a man I had known for approximately one night during a storm. He had left things, though. On the 3-legged stool beside the cot, a cloth bundle containing hard bread, a piece of dried meat, and 2 small apples, a water skin, full, and beneath the bundle, held flat by the weight of the food, a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. The handwriting was clean and economical. No wasted strokes, every letter deliberate. Western approach is clear this morning. Dawnvale riders moved south before dawn. Likely a survey run, not an advance. The neutral forest is safe for passage today. The market road from the northern tree line will bring you to Fenwick Village by mid-afternoon. There's a woman there named Sarah, who runs the grain warehouse. Tell her Tristan sent you. She'll know what it means. TV. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it inside my cloak. I sat with the bread and the apple and the water skin and the quiet morning sounds of the forest. And I thought about what it meant that the Alpha King of the Northern Ridge had rebuilt my fire while I slept, left me food for the road, and written me directions to safety, and had not waited to be thanked for any of it. I didn't know what to do with that. So I ate the bread, drank the water, and started walking. Fenwick was exactly where the note said it would be. It was a small, dense village at the edge of the neutral forest. The kind of place that existed because trade needed a seam between territories, not because anyone had particularly intended to build a town there. The buildings were practical rather than pretty. Wide-fronted storage structures, a large covered market space, several inns built for function over comfort. The streets were churned to mud from the night's rain, and the people moving through them had the brisk, purposeful quality of those who worked in commerce rather than politics. I found the grain warehouse by following the smell of dry wheat and sawdust to a large timber building near the village's center. The woman inside, Sarah, was perhaps 50, compact and sharp-eyed, with silver-streaked dark hair pinned back severely, and the calloused hands of someone who had never delegated physical work in her life. She was directing 2 young men in the stacking of sacks when I appeared in the doorway, and she looked me over with the frank appraisal of someone who had seen a great many people arrive from the direction of the neutral forest. "Tristan sent me," I said. Something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened. "Come in then," she said. "You're wet at the hem, and you've got the look of someone who slept on a cot." "One cot," I confirmed. "His cabin." She said it as a statement, not a question, and something knowing moved through her eyes that I couldn't fully interpret. She handed a directive to one of the young men and gestured for me to follow her to a small back office, a room with a desk, 2 chairs, a brazier, and a shelf of ledgers. "Sit. I'll get tea." She got tea. She also got a bowl of something hot and savory that I ate without asking what it was, because my body made the decision before my manners could intervene. Sarah sat across from me and watched me eat with a patience that suggested she had done this before. Received people from the forest, fed them, waited for them to feel human again before asking questions. When I set down the empty bowl, she said, "What are your skills?" I blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Skills? What can you do?" She said it practically, the way someone might ask for an inventory count. Not what rank you were. Not what pack you belong to. What do you know how to do? I thought about it honestly. I can read and write in 3 regional dialects. I know basic herb medicine, wound treatment, fever management, pain relief. I'm a reasonable hand at cartography. I spent 2 years assisting our pack's border recorder before he left. I paused. I'm good at moving through spaces without being noticed. Sarah's eyebrow went up at the last one. Honest answer. It seemed like a moment for honesty. She studied me. Then she reached across the desk and opened a ledger. I run supply coordination for 6 villages along the neutral corridor. I need someone who can read contracts, track movement records, and carry documents between posts without attracting attention. She looked up. The position includes a room above this warehouse, meals, and a reasonable wage. It is not glamorous work. I stared at her. Tristan arranged this. Tristan told me to expect someone who might need a position. He didn't describe you, didn't tell me to hire you unconditionally. The decision is mine. She held my gaze. And now yours. I thought about the road north, which I had been planning to take. I thought about what waited there. Unfamiliar territory, no connections. The slow, grinding work of establishing myself from nothing in a place that had no reason to trust me. Then I thought about supply routes and movement records and documents passing through the neutral corridor, and how someone who was good at cartography and at moving unnoticed might, in that role, begin to understand the geography of what was happening between Dawnvale and the Northern Territories, in a way that mattered. I thought about the map Tristan had been marking in the firelight. "I'll take the position," I said. The next 3 weeks were the most grounded I had felt in months. Sarah was a demanding employer in the best possible sense. She expected accuracy, discretion, and punctuality, and she noticed immediately when any of the three was lacking. She was not warm in the way that invited familiarity, but she was fair in a way that was worth more. She explained things once and expected you to remember. She did not explain why she trusted certain routes and avoided others, but she noticed that I noticed the pattern without being told, and after the first week, she began briefing me more fully before assigning document runs. I learned the neutral corridor in those weeks the way you learn a piece of music. First the broad shape, then the specific notes, then the gaps where things were conspicuously absent. I learned which villages received Iron Veil supply support quietly, and which ones publicly. I learned that 3 of the 6 villages Sarah coordinated had recently declined to renew arrangements with Dawnvale traders, and that 2 of those 3 had experienced minor but pointed supply disruptions in the weeks following. I wrote it all down in a small notebook I kept inside my cloak. I told myself it was habit. Good record-keeping. The trained instinct of someone who had spent years assisting a border recorder. But on the 18th day, when I came back from a document run to the mill village at the corridor's eastern end and found a familiar figure standing in Sarah's office. Long dark braids, leather and fur, a map spread across the desk. I understood that some part of me had been keeping records because some part of me had expected, or hoped, that they would eventually be useful to him. Tristan looked up when I came through the door. His expression moved through something I couldn't name before settling back into its usual stillness. "Rose," he said. "You're checking on the corridor," I said, because it seemed safer than acknowledging the way the room had changed when he walked into it. "I'm checking on several things." His gaze moved to the notebook in my hand, then back to my face. "Sarah tells me you've been thorough. Sarah told you about my work? Sarah tells me about everything that happens in this corridor." He said it without apology. "She's been doing it for 11 years. I looked at Sarah, who was watching us both with that unreadable expression that I had come to suspect contained a great deal more amusement than she ever allowed to surface. "The mill village," I said, making a decision. I crossed to the desk and opened my notebook and laid it flat beside his map. "The Eastern supply disruption isn't random. Look at the dates." He looked down at my notes. Then slowly, he looked up at me. "You tracked this yourself," he said. In 3 weeks, 4 villages in the Eastern Corridor experienced what looked like unrelated delays, roads, weather, supplier absences. But the pattern reads like pressure, coordinated. Someone is making it uncomfortable to maintain neutrality without technically violating any agreements. The room was quiet. Then Tristan reached out and turned my notebook slightly toward him and read the full 2 pages of notes I had compiled, and I stood beside him at Sarah's desk and watched his expression as he read. And I saw the moment something shifted in how he was looking at the information. Not surprise. Something more careful than surprise, like recognition. "Where did you learn to read patterns like this?" he asked quietly. 2 years assisting a border recorder," I said, "and a lifetime of being the person in the room that no one thinks is paying attention." He looked up from the notebook and met my eyes, and for the first time since the cabin, I saw something in his expression that wasn't controlled or measured or carefully neutral. It was the look of someone who had just found something he hadn't known he was missing. The meeting was called for the following morning. I didn't expect to be included. That is not false modesty. It is simply the mathematics of what I was. An unattached omega. 3 weeks employed in a supply warehouse. with no formal standing in any pack hierarchy and no title that would warrant a seat at a table where alpha-level decisions were being made. I expected Tristan to take my notebook, thank me with the same quiet efficiency with which he had left me bread and a note in the cabin, and disappear back into the political architecture of his world. Instead, at the end of the evening, when Sarah had banked the brazier and the ledgers were closed and the warehouse had gone quiet, he paused at the doorway and looked back at me. "Tomorrow, 6th hour. Don't be late." Then he was gone. I looked at Sarah. She was already pulling her coat from the hook by the door. "Don't ask me to explain him," she said, without looking up. "I've had 11 years and I still can't do it reliably." The meeting was held not in Fenwick, but 2 miles north, in a long, low building set into the tree line that I had passed a dozen times on document runs, without ever understanding its function. From the outside, it looked like a storage annex, unmarked, practical, easy to overlook. From the inside, it was a war room. Maps covered every surface. Not decorative maps, not territorial claims drawn for ceremony. Working maps, dense with annotation, with pins and thread and charcoal markings that told the story of a region under slow, methodical pressure. There were 6 people already present when I arrived. Owen, whom I recognized from the storm. 2 others I didn't know, but whose bearing identified them clearly as Senior Ironvale, a woman named Delia, who I would learn was Tristan's head of border intelligence, and an older man with a white beard and the careful stillness of someone who had survived a great many rooms like this one by speaking only when he was certain. His name was Aldrich. He had been the border recorder for 2 packs before Ironvale, the last being, I felt my stomach drop slightly to learn, Ashvale. He was the man I had spent 2 years assisting. He recognized me the moment I walked through the door. His eyebrows rose with the particular expression of someone encountering the past in an unexpected corridor. "Rose," he said. "Aldrich," I said. Tristan, standing at the far end of the room before the largest map, looked between us. "You know each other." "She was my assistant," Aldrich said. He studied me with something that was partly assessment and partly something warmer. For 2 years. She was better at the work than she was ever given credit for. Something in my chest tightened at that. Not painfully. Just the specific ache of being seen clearly by someone who had watched you be overlooked. "Sit," Tristan said to me. Not dismissively, the same tone as always, directional without weight. "This is where you belong in this room." I sat. The meeting lasted 3 hours. What I learned in those 3 hours rearranged my understanding of the region so fundamentally that I had to keep my face carefully still to prevent it from showing. Dawnvale was not simply expanding. They were executing a strategy that had been in development for at least 2 years. A systematic weakening of the neutral corridor and the smaller packs bordering it, designed to create a land path between their eastern territories and the high forest to the north. The supply disruptions I had documented were one layer. There were others. Quiet offers made to struggling pack members, alternative trade arrangements that looked generous until you read the secondary clauses, strategic absences from regional councils that shifted voting power without anyone technically breaking protocol. Corbett of Ashvale had not been naive. He had been targeted. His alliance offer had been met with exactly enough encouragement to make him overextend, and then the ground had been pulled away at precisely the right moment. I had watched my home dissolve, and not understood what I was watching. Now I understood. "The neutral forest is the keystone," Delia said, her voice clipped and precise. She had dark eyes and the focused energy of someone running on competence, and very little sleep. "If they establish a permanent presence in the corridor, they cut Ironvale's eastern access route and consolidate 3 border settlements under their influence simultaneously." "How long do we have?" Owen asked. "Before they move formally? Weeks, not months." She tapped a point on the map. "This is where the survey riders were 2 nights ago. This is where our perimeter scouts reported unusual activity last week." She traced a line between the 2 points. They're triangulating the cabin site. The cabin. I looked at Tristan. He was already looking at me. They know about the cabin? I asked. They know there's a structure in the central neutral zone, Delia said. They may not know its origin yet, but if they establish that it's been used recently, she left the rest unspoken. It becomes evidence of Iron Veil presence in unclaimed territory, the older of the two senior wolves said. His name was Brand, and he had the particular wariness of someone who had navigated legal disputes before, which they'd use to claim we've been covertly occupying the neutral forest, which gives them grounds to petition the regional council for a formal investigation, Aldrich added quietly. And during an investigation, all territorial movement pauses, including Iron Veil's eastern supply lines. The room was very quiet. I looked down at my notebook, open on the table before me. The dates I had recorded, the pattern I had traced across 3 weeks of document runs and warehouse conversations, and the careful accumulation of small details that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. The villages, I said. Everyone looked at me. I kept my eyes on the map. The 4 villages I documented, they're not just being pressured to abandon neutrality. They're being pressured to testify. If Dawnvale pushes an investigation claim to the regional council, they'll need witnesses confirming Iron Veil presence in the corridor. I looked up. Disrupting supply and trade relationships is how you create witnesses who feel they have nothing to lose by cooperating with whoever offers them stability. The silence that followed was a different quality than before. Delia was looking at me with narrow, focused eyes. Brand had stopped shifting in his chair. Owen's expression had moved from its default professional neutrality to something more genuinely attentive. Aldrich looked at the table, and I could see the small private acknowledgement in his expression. There she is. There is the thing I always saw. Tristan said nothing, but I felt his attention the way you feel a change in air pressure, not visible, not loud, but undeniably present. If that's the mechanism, Delia said slowly, then resecuring those village relationships before the council petition is filed. Removes the testimony base, I said. They can claim whatever they want about the cabin. Without corroborating witnesses, it's assertion against assertion, and Iron Veil's established record in the region outweighs Dawnvale's claim. The village relationships can't be resecured with supply arrangements alone, Brand said. Dawnvale will match anything we offer. Not everything is about supply, I said. I thought about the mill village, about the warehouse keeper there who had spoken to me for 40 minutes about his daughter's difficulty finding placement in a guild north of the ridge, about the elder in the eastern settlement who had shown me a border dispute record going back 30 years that no one had ever formally resolved in their favor. Some of those villages want things that have nothing to do with grain or trade. They want to be heard. They want someone with actual authority to acknowledge that they exist. I paused. Tristan could visit them, I said. The room shifted. Not in discomfort, in the particular recalibration that happens when something obvious is said aloud by the person least expected to say it. I looked at Tristan directly, because this part required it. Not as an alpha king conducting territorial business. As someone who moves through this corridor, who knows it, who built a cabin in it because he valued what it was. Someone who treats these villages as part of something rather than adjacent to something. I held his gaze. You've been managing this region from above. They need to feel it from the same level. The room was quiet long enough that I began to wonder if I had overstepped in a way that couldn't be walked back. Then Tristan said, "How many villages?" 4 to resecure fully. 2 more that are wavering but haven't committed to either side yet. I looked at my notebook. 6 total, if we move within the week. We. The word came out before I examined it. I felt the slight heat rise in my face. But Tristan didn't correct it. 6 villages, he said. 1 week. He looked at Delia, then at Owen, then back at me. Plan the route. You know the corridor better than anyone in this room right now. I stared at him. Me. You've made the runs. You know which roads are passable after rain, which village heads respond to morning visits versus afternoon. You know what they need to hear and how to hear it. His voice was even. Plan the route, Rose. Aldrich made a sound that might from anyone else have been a laugh. I pulled the notebook toward me and uncapped the small charcoal stick I carried in my pocket, and I began to draw a route across the map, and no one in the room questioned it. We left the following dawn. The traveling party was small by design. Tristan, Owen, Aldrich, myself, and 2 others who moved quietly and well. We took the eastern path first, the one I knew best, and I rode beside Aldrich as we cleared the tree line and the gray morning opened around us. You're not what I expected to find here, Aldrich said after a while. What did you expect to find? Someone hiding, he said gently. After Ashvale. I thought... He paused. I thought you might have gone to ground somewhere and stayed there. I thought about the cabin, about the cold and the rain, and the exhaustion that had pulled me under before I could make a reasonable decision. I almost did, I said. What stopped you? I looked ahead, where Tristan rode at the front of the group, straight-backed, unhurried, the morning light touching the dark of his braids. Someone left me food for the road, I said, and directions. Aldrich followed my gaze. Then he looked back at the path ahead and said nothing, but his silence had the particular texture of a man who understood a great deal more than he was currently choosing to say. The first village was 3 miles east. I had work to do. The first village was called Hartwell, and it smelled like wet stone and wood smoke, and the particular sharpness of a community that had been holding its breath for too long. We arrived mid-morning, when the market square was active enough that our presence was immediately visible, but not so crowded that it felt like a demonstration. I had planned it that way deliberately. Visible enough to matter, small enough not to intimidate. The village head, a weathered woman named Marin, met us at the square's edge with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to show preference until she understood the terms. I stepped forward before Tristan could, because I had been to Hartwell twice on document runs and Marin knew my face. Marin, I said. Thank you for receiving us. Her eyes moved past me to Tristan, and I watched the recognition move through her. Slow, then sudden, the way it always happened when people placed him. Alpha King, she said carefully. Just Tristan, he said, and something in the plainness of it, the complete absence of performance, made her blink. I came because Rose told me about the road flooding at your eastern approach last autumn, the one that cut your harvest delivery by 11 days. Marin stared at him. That was 7 months ago. The record was in Aldrich's border files, Tristan said. He nodded toward Aldrich, who raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement. The flooding was caused by drainage blockage at the ridge runoff point. A structural issue, not a weather issue. It can be addressed before the next harvest season if the work starts now. He held her gaze. I should have known about it sooner. I'm sorry that I didn't. The square had gone subtly quieter. Not silent. Market sounds continued at the edges. But the people nearest to us had slowed, were listening without appearing to. Marin looked at Tristan for a long time. Then she looked at me. I gave her nothing. No encouraging nod. No signal. This had to be her choice, made clearly. Come inside, she said finally. There's tea. We spent 2 hours in Hartwell. By the time we left, Marin had shared 3 years of accumulated grievances, not angrily, but with the exhausted relief of someone who had been waiting for a room in which to say them. And Tristan had listened to all of it without deflecting or qualifying. He made 2 specific commitments: the drainage repair and a formal acknowledgement of Hartwell's border dispute record that had been sitting unresolved in regional council files for decades. He asked Owen to note both, clearly and in writing, before we left the village. Marin walked us to the road. The Dawnvale traders came through last month, she said, at the edge of the square. She said it quietly, not looking at Tristan. They offered good terms, better than we've had. I know, Tristan said. I told them I needed time to consider. That was your right. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the terms they offered had a secondary clause. I almost missed it. She looked up at him. It required us to provide testimony to any regional council inquiry if asked, regarding traffic and presence in the neutral corridor. The air shifted. We didn't agree to it, Marin said, but I want you to know it was asked. Tristan held her gaze. Thank you for telling me. Thank Rose, Marin said simply. She listened to me talk about my village for 40 minutes last month when she was here on a routine run. Nobody does that unless they actually care. She looked at me. I knew when you came back that it meant something. I didn't know what to say to that. I think I managed a nod. We rode out of Hartwell into the pale midday light, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead, and Owen fell in beside me after a few minutes of silence. Secondary clause, he said quietly. That's the mechanism. They're embedding testimony requirements into trade agreements and hoping no one reads the fine print. Or hoping that people who need the terms badly enough will sign without pushing back, I said. How many of the 6 villages do you think received the same offer? I thought about the patterns I had documented. The specific shape of the disruptions, which villages had experienced pressure first, which had held longest. At least 4, I said, possibly 5. Then we need to know which one signed. I know how to find out, I said, and I did, not through confrontation or demand, but through the same method that had given me Marin's confidence. Attention, consistency, showing up, and actually listening. Owen looked at me sideways. You've done this kind of work before. No, I said honestly, but I've spent my whole life watching people be ignored, and I know what it looks like when someone is finally seen. It makes them want to talk. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Tristan was right to bring you. I didn't answer, because Tristan had pulled his horse back slightly and was now riding level with me, and I wasn't sure how much of that he had heard. We moved through 4 more villages over the following 3 days. Each one was different. Different concerns, different histories, different particular wounds that had been accumulating in the silence of being small and peripheral. A dispute over water rights in one settlement. A family in another whose son had been unfairly expelled from a regional guild. In a third, a record of land boundaries that had been redrawn 40 years ago in a way that had quietly disadvantaged the village ever since, and which 2 generations of village heads had raised with regional councils to no effect. Tristan listened to all of it. He made commitments that were specific and achievable rather than grand and vague, and when he didn't know the answer to something, he said so directly and named the person he would consult. He asked questions that showed he had actually absorbed what was said before, rather than simply waiting for the speaking to stop. I watched him do this across 3 days and 4 villages, and I understood something that reordered a number of assumptions I had been carrying. Power, when it was exercised this way, did not look like dominance. It looked like presence. It looked like someone choosing, repeatedly and without fanfare, to close the distance between their authority and the people it affected. Tristan had been doing this, quietly, without announcement, for 6 years. And no one in his own council had thought to bring an unattached Omega from a dissolved pack along on the visits to tell him which road flooded and what the village head cared about most. On the 4th night, we camped at the edge of the neutral forest, rather than ride back to Fenwick. Owen and the 2 others settled a distance away, and Aldrich had fallen into an early sleep with the ease of a man who had long ago made peace with uncomfortable ground. The fire was small and well built. I had learned by now that Tristan built every fire the same way, with the same deliberate economy, and the forest around us was full of the quiet sounds of a living night. He was sharpening a blade by firelight, the motion slow and meditative. I was reviewing my notebook, the updated version, dense now with 3 days of new information. 3 of the 5 villages received the secondary clause, I said. Marin's was the only one that held. The other 2 signed. Can the signatures be challenged? Aldrich thinks so. The clause was embedded in a way that arguably misrepresents the nature of the agreement, but it would require a formal council review. I paused, which Dawnvale is also pursuing, just from the other direction. Tristan set the blade down. Then we file first. Aldrich is already drafting the submission. I closed the notebook. He says it will be ready within 2 days. The fire crackled between us. Above, the forest canopy was thin enough at this point to show stars. Not many, just a scattering of them through the branches, pale and very far away. You built the cabin 7 years ago, I said, not a question this time. Yes. After you became Alpha King. A pause. 6 months after. I looked at the fire. That's a specific timing. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then, the first year was complicated. There were challenges to the succession, disputes I hadn't anticipated, people I had trusted who turned out to be positioned rather than loyal. He picked up the blade again, turned it in his hands without resuming the sharpening. I needed somewhere that had nothing to do with any of it, somewhere I could think without it being a political act. I understood that with my whole body, the need for a place that was simply yours, unobserved, unclaimed by anyone else's narrative of who you were or should be. I walked into your somewhere, I said. Yes. And then, quietly, I'm glad you did. I looked up at him. He was looking at the fire, not at me. And the plainness of it, the absence of strategy in how he said it, made it land more heavily than any more elaborate declaration could have. I thought about the morning I had woken to find him gone, and felt the specific loneliness of an empty room. I thought about my notebook, and the way he had said plan the route without a trace of doubt. I thought about Marin saying thank Rose, and Aldrich saying better than she was ever given credit for, and the look on Owen's face when he said Tristan was right to bring you. I thought about what it meant to spend a lifetime being the person in the room that no one thought was paying attention, and then to find yourself in a room where someone had noticed, had always been noticing, and had simply been waiting for the moment to say so in a way that showed rather than told. I want to stay, I said. Not in the cabin, not just in Fenwick. I held his gaze when he looked up. I want to be useful in the way I've been useful this week, formally, whatever that looks like. He looked at me for a long moment. That still, deep look that I had learned over the course of 6 days was not blankness, but its opposite. Full attention. The council will have questions, he said. About rank, about standing. I know. They'll say an unattached Omega has no formal place in territorial strategy. They'll be wrong, I said, and I think you know that. Something settled in his expression. Something that had been held carefully in place for a long time finally allowed itself to rest. Aldrich's position has needed a proper second for 2 years, he said. Someone who can read patterns, run the corridor, and speak to village heads in a way that makes them feel heard. A pause. The title would be Border Intelligence Liaison. It carries council standing. I stared at him. That's a real position. I wouldn't invent one. You're offering it to me. I'm telling you it exists, and that you are, by a significant measure, the most qualified person I have encountered for it. He held my gaze. The decision is yours. I thought, briefly, of the night I had walked into the neutral forest with nothing but a soaked cloak and a stubbornness that exhaustion couldn't kill. I thought about the cold ash smell of an abandoned cabin and a fire I hadn't built warming a room I hadn't expected to feel safe in. Yes, I said. The regional council petition was filed by Ironvale 3 days later, 2 hours before Dawnvale's submission reached the council recorder's desk. The review process took 6 weeks. I spent most of them in the records room in Fenwick with Aldrich, building the case document by document, pattern by pattern, with the same methodical attention I had applied to everything else. Aldrich worked beside me with the ease of a man who had finally found the collaboration he had been missing. And sometimes Tristan appeared in the doorway in the evenings, reviewed what we had compiled, and added the kind of contextual knowledge that only comes from 6 years of leading a territory through difficulty. The council's finding, when it came, was unambiguous. Dawnvale's embedded testimony clauses constituted a procedural violation of neutral corridor agreements. The signed documents were voided. The survey activity in the neutral forest was formally flagged as an unauthorized territorial probe. Dawnvale withdrew from the corridor. It was not a dramatic ending. There was no confrontation, no ceremony of defeat. They simply recalculated, found the position untenable, and redirected their strategy elsewhere. Power, when it is properly applied, does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply closes the doors quietly and lets the silence do the work. 6 months later, I stood in the long room at the tree line, the war room, though we had begun calling it the strategy room, because the nature of the work had shifted from defense to something more like architecture, and I looked at the map that now covered the entire eastern wall. My additions were visible in a different color of charcoal: the village routes, the corridor patterns, the supply network that Sarah and I had rebuilt over the course of the spring into something more resilient and more equitable than what it had been before. The border dispute records that Aldrich and I had resolved, one by one, in the villages that had waited decades to be heard. Hartwell's drainage repair had been completed before the harvest season. Marin had sent a note to Fenwick that was 3 lines long and entirely practical in tone, but which I had read 4 times. Aldrich had formally named me his co-recorder in a brief ceremony attended by exactly 7 people, which was exactly right. Tristan had been one of the 7. He had stood at the back of the room with Owen and said nothing during the ceremony. And after it was done, he had crossed to where I stood and simply said, "Good." And the weight of that single word, from a man who did not use words for decoration, was enough. On the first cold morning of autumn, I walked to the neutral forest alone. The cabin looked the same from the outside. Warped door, dirty window, the particular stillness of a place that exists outside of other people's narratives. Inside, someone had replaced the moth-eaten blanket with a better one. The shelf now held 4 mugs instead of 2. The iron hook by the door still held my gray wool cloak, the one with the blue ash veil stitching at the hem, exactly where I had left it the morning I walked away. I sat on the edge of the cot and felt the silence settle around me, and it was not the silence of someone hiding. It was the silence of someone who had found, after a long and winding road, exactly where they were supposed to be. Outside, the first leaves of the autumn were beginning to fall through the clean morning air. The neutral forest stood as it always had, unclaimed, unowned, belonging to anyone who needed it, and no one who wanted to take it. I stayed for a while. Then I walked back to Fenwick, to the records room and the maps and the work that was mine, and I did not look back. Not because I was leaving anything behind, but because for the first time in as long as I could remember, everything I needed was in the direction I was already walking. Rose served as Border Intelligence Liaison for 11 years, eventually becoming the Regional Council's first formally recognized neutral corridor representative, a position created specifically because of the gap her work had exposed. Aldrich retired 2 years into her appointment and spent his remaining years writing a comprehensive border history of the region, dedicating it to the assistant he said had always been better at the work than he was. Owen remained Tristan's second for the rest of his tenure, and the two developed the kind of professional trust that outlasts most formal alliances. Sarah continued running the grain warehouse in Fenwick until she was well into her 60s, at which point she handed the operation to one of the young men she had trained and spent the following years doing exactly as she pleased. Tristan led the Iron Vale territory for 22 years in total. He was not remembered as the most powerful alpha king of his era. There were others with larger armies, more aggressive expansion, louder reputations. He was remembered as the most trusted, the one whose word held, the one who listened. The cabin in the neutral forest was never formally claimed. It remained where it had always been, available to anyone who needed shelter, stocked with enough supplies for a night, with a folded blanket on the cot and 4 mugs on the shelf. It smelled like wood smoke and quiet, and somewhere underneath it all, like the particular piece of a place where something important had been allowed to begin.